Welcome to the In the Sweetgrass with Misty Flowers. In the Sweetgrass is a video podcast that was created as a way to document and share our culture at a wider level. Misty Flowers is the Executive Director of NICWC. She is a member of the Santee Sioux Nation of Nebraska and is a descendant of the Tlingit of Alaska and Ho-Chunk. Kirby Williams is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. She is the Tribal Trafficking Resource Specialist for NICWC.
Kirby Williams, Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and inviting me to come chat with you all today. My name is Kirby Williams. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I'm currently a violence prevention specialist working here in Nebraska with the tribes. I work with NICWC on their tribal trafficking of Native youth prevention program. And I also am serving as the interim executive director for the Nebraska Tribes Addressing Violence Coalition, also known as NICWC. And I'm super thankful to have Misty on our board for that and to be able to work with her in all different capacities. So really excited to chat with y'all today, even though this isn't a super exciting topic, but it is at least a very important one.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, Kirby, for joining me today and talking about this very important topic. Like you said, it's not, not something that we really want to talk about, but I do believe that it needs to be, as much awareness as we can possibly get out there, the better. And so I guess first off, before you get started, and maybe you're going to talk about this in your presentation, but why is this week important? Or if you're going to be talking about that in your presentation, we can wait until then.
Yeah, I will be talking about that, but I think, so this week falls in line with, on Friday is May 5th. That is actually the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. That date was chosen to honor Hannah Harris. She was a Northern Cheyenne Nation citizen. She was a young mother who unfortunately went missing and was very sadly found to have been murdered. And her family has just done tremendous work in raising awareness of this crisis and this issue. And so it's kind of turned into where the week leading up to May 5th, or whatever week that May 5th falls on, we take that week as an action week in the Native community. And we hope our non-Native allies also take that as an action week to really focus on the families and our communities who are hurting and are in need, and to try and start raising awareness and preventing this crisis.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, Kirby, I will just go ahead and turn it over to you. And I may pipe in if I have questions or comments or, anything to add, but go for it.
Please do. So we are going to start today by talking about, obviously, I'm sure that quite a few people who will tune into this do identify as Native or come from our tribal communities. But we also wanted to share this information for folks who may be non-Native and may want to learn more. So this is going to try and cover sort of the broad scope when we talk about MMIP. We will also talk about how to navigate an MMIP situation. So hopefully you don't find yourself in these situations, but odds are you will at least come in contact with someone who is. So we want to give folks some kind of action steps on how to move forward with that. And especially also for non-Native folks, how to engage as an ally to the Indigenous community when it comes to this topic. I always like to just give everyone a content warning before we go any further. Please take care of yourselves. Please feel free to log off if you need to. Don't feel like you have to stay on for this. This is a lot to take in, and it will be recorded and available for you in the future when you are in more of a capacity to take this on. So With that, I like to kind of jump in and start with, well, okay, well, what is MMIP and, all of those different letters that you're throwing out. So MMIP typically stands for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Crisis. You may also hear this as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis, or the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Crisis, MMIW, MMID, MMIG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. I tend to just use MMIP to be inclusive and just as a general sort of reference. This awareness movement actually started up in Canada, found its way, gained momentum down here in the US. I'm very clear I'm talking about the awareness movement, not the crisis itself. The crisis itself has been happening for well over 500 years with colonialism and genocide and all that other fun stuff. And so, like we mentioned, May 5th is the National Day of Awareness here in the US. Common awareness imagery you may see associated with this, things like red dresses. So as you may be able to see, I'm wearing red dress earrings. This was made by an Indigenous beater. Her name is Gretchen Carroll. Super excited to have these to wear to raise awareness for this. You may see a lot of red handprints. So you may have seen a woman by the name of Jordan Marie Daniel Brings Three White Horses. She's run the Boston Marathon a couple of times in the past. And for each mile that she runs, she does so in prayer or in remembrance of an MMIP victim. And she oftentimes will wear a red handprint across her face as a very strong awareness imagery for this. You may see things like no more stolen sisters, no more stolen relatives. All of that is in relation to the awareness movement that we're talking about. And then MMIP can also be in reference to the data crisis that we have on our hands. So the reality of the matter is we actually don't have a great count on how many of our relatives are missing. And that sometimes gives pause to some folks because it's like, well, how can you say it's a crisis but not know how many folks are missing? And so what I like to point out is, there's a lot of discrepancies between these systems that we're talking about. So for instance, the National Crime Information Center back in 2016 reported well over 5,700 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. NAMIS, the National Persons Missing Database, only logged 116 of those cases. So we have a lot of these different systems that aren't communicating. They're not taking in the same data quality. They're not communicating with each other. And so that's where we see a lot of discrepancies. Now, there have been some federal efforts to try and close this gap and close these disparities, but we do have a significant ways to go before we have better communicative data systems. And so to try and get a handle on what does this crisis look like and where is it occurring, the Urban Indian Health Institute actually looked at cases back in 2018. They looked at 506 unique cases for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across 71 US cities. And for those of us here in Nebraska, what was especially alarming for us is that the state of Nebraska ranked 7th in the highest number of MMIWG cases that they studied for US states. And the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where I currently reside, ranked 8th in the top 10 US cities for the highest number of cases that they studied. I don't know about the rest of y'all, that doesn't make me feel so great. And so this lacking data quality is actually attributed to a lot of different factors. So things like poor record keeping and racial misclassification. So for instance, I am very aware of how I look. And if I were to go missing, it is very likely that my identity as a Native woman would not be classified as such. We also especially see this happen to our Black, Native, and Afro-Indigenous relatives, where they are only classified as Black or African American, but that Native component is still extremely important when we're trying to look for leads and we're trying to find connections to hopefully find our relatives. We also see where Native folks are just straight up misclassified completely, where they're classified more likely as Latino or Asian when they may not actually belong to those race ethnicity groups. We also know that a lot of these systems that we're talking about, these data systems, in a lot of cases, the default is actually white. So that is also extremely alarming and concerning when you're trying to get track of someone or you're trying to make sure that a case is being logged correctly. If the default is white, then that's really erasing a lot of our relatives' identities. We also see a lot of issues with this data crisis in relation to underreporting, which is often linked to things like poor relationships between law enforcement and tribal communities. So for instance, a lot of times when our Native families go to report their loved one as missing, they are met with the response a lot of times from law enforcement of, well, they're probably just out partying. or they're probably just out drinking, or, you can't file a missing persons report until it's been 24, 48, 72, insert some arbitrary number here, which we'll talk about that here in just a moment. That's actually completely not true. Or they're met with the response of, well, we don't really have the resources or the time to go look for them. So if you want to go look for them, you're going to have to do it yourself. And that's actually what happened to Hannah Harris's family. They were the ones who had to organize the search parties to go look for her, and they were the ones to actually find her body. And we hear about this countless number of times. So it's not to say that's happening everywhere, but it is to say it's happened enough times that you have a lot of that mistrust and that fear that if we go to report our loved one is missing, that it's not going to be taken seriously. And then MMIP can be in reference to really the crisis itself. So why is it that our Native relatives, our Indigenous family members and friends and community members, why are they going missing and being murdered at such high rates? And while we in our tribal communities tend to know a lot of the contributing factors and the reasons that are behind this, it's a lot of different contributing factors. We also know that typically if we're going to get any kind of funding or support to actually address those contributing factors and to try and prevent this crisis from happening, we do have to have good data, right? And so that's why we put such an emphasis with these state systems that they need to start collecting that data better. That's why we put a lot of support and really try to uplift Native organizations and databases that are tracking this, and the fact that we should own our own data. But what we do know in terms of this crisis is that the CDC reports that murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. Violence on some reservations, now I'm very clear, just some reservations, not all reservations, but on some reservations, it can be 10 times higher than the national average, the murder rate. And there's very little research done on Native Americans like myself who live in urban settings or don't live on a specific tribal reservation, despite the fact that well over 70% of the US Native American population does not live on a tribal reservation and actually lives in urban areas, right? So you have a huge portion of the population that's being ignored when we are trying to track how this is occurring. And then it's also, the crisis is attributed to things like intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicides, human trafficking of Native people, jurisdiction concerns and issues. There's a lot of questioning a lot of times when these cases come up of, well, who has jurisdiction? Is it tribal police? Is it the feds? Is it state police? And trying to navigate that can be really complicated. We talked a little bit about differences in investigative treatment, and then there's just really an overall lack of media coverage. I just did a presentation, and over the years, I've seen an increase in hands of folks who are becoming more aware of this crisis, but I actually just gave a presentation to about 50 folks, and only one person raised their hand as having heard of the MMIP crisis, right? And that's really concerning, and that's really alarming. We also have to recognize that the media oftentimes does not represent our missing relatives or our murdered relatives in a positive light. I was listening to a panel one time where a family was talking about when their loved one went missing, they actually reported it, law enforcement actually drafted a poster, but the way that the poster was worded made it seem like their relative was a violent criminal who shouldn't be approached at all costs. And so the family had to go back to them and say, whoa, they are a victim. We can't find them. If somebody sees them, we want them to go up to them and help them. And so they lost a lot of that precious time just trying to get folks to understand that you have to portray our relatives in a positive light, that we're not violent criminals, that we are not folks who people should just ignore, that we are people who deserve to be found and to be safe. And that we are asking for folks' help when we release some of that. And so then when we look at Nebraska specifically, there have been some studies that have started to look at, okay, well, what does this crisis look like in our state? So we do know that for one, there's a very high disproportionality and a link between the disproportionality of the child involvement in the child welfare system, and the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. Nebraska in particular typically consistently ranks in the top 5 states with the highest disproportionality rates of Native children in the child welfare system. And so what we find is that Native children are going missing or we're losing them in the system and we can't keep track of them. And so we find that that does have a direct link that is feeding into this crisis. In Nebraska, Indigenous girls represent 13% of all missing girls in the state, yet they only represent 1% of our state's population. And then the Sovereign Bodies Institute was actually looking at their cases. They actually house one of the largest databases worldwide for missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so when they were looking at their cases in Nebraska, they found that over half of all cases were girls aged 18 and under. 2/3 of the cases are unsolved. Nearly half of the alleged perpetrators have never been charged, never been convicted, and 2/3 of the alleged perpetrators are non-native. So this matches up with a lot of the sort of national trends that you'll hear about. And so this is very much a crisis that we have here in our state as well. Now, I know that a lot of that is very a little dismal to listen to. So I do want to point out that there have been some efforts to try and address this. I really would classify these more as like starting steps. I don't think that any of these are a one-all solution, but we are seeing some steps being taken to try and address this crisis. So back in 2020, there was a report released in correlation to Nebraska LB 154. This was a report that was heavily skewed towards law enforcement response for missing persons cases in Nebraska, but was specifically focused on missing Native women and children. We saw Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, both signed in September of 2020. They were also focused on trying to clarify some of the jurisdiction responsibilities when it comes to reporting missing cases, looking at increasing access to resources, and just trying to get all of these different systems working together a little better. In the last year, we've also seen legislation introduced here in Nebraska to try and establish a missing and murdered Indigenous persons staff member in the Nebraska Attorney General's office, and we'll see what winds up happening with that. But there are some steps that are at least being taken to try and address this crisis. So then, key steps that folks can take now that we understand kind of what this awareness movement is, that now that we understand what this crisis is, most people's kind of first response is, okay, well then now what do I do, right? So all of this really, I'm just sharing this with anyone and everyone because obviously, like I said, I don't know exactly who's listening, who's watching this, but maybe you'll find yourself unfortunately in a situation where you're navigating a missing persons case or you're supporting a family going through this. The more we can share this to make it common knowledge, the better off I think really we will all be. So this image actually comes from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and it's just sort of a starting visual guide to sort of help folks as they are navigating the situation. So let's say we have a Native person who goes missing. Some key, kind of first important steps that we can take is one, like not hesitating, right? Like I want you to take action if you think someone is missing or if you think that some foul play has occurred. We really have to ask the question, is the person missing against their will? And I'll get a little more into that here in just a moment. The next step would be informing police. So making sure that we do get records with law enforcement. I know that for some folks that can be really concerning. Sometimes it's difficult for folks to approach law enforcement or to contact law enforcement, and I completely understand that. But what we have to recognize with a lot of these cases like this is that in order to access appropriate resources, there usually has to be a police report on file. And I will get more into that here in just a moment as well. We also want to focus on tracking events, trying to issue any public alerts if that fits the criteria, and then really focus also on taking care of yourself. So to dive a little deeper into some of these kind of bubbles, so initial questions that we want to ask ourselves if we have a missing persons case is, one, is the disappearance voluntary? And so what I mean by this is, are we making sure that is this person who we think has gone missing, are they trying to cut ties with their family? Are they fleeing an abusive situation? Maybe they don't want to be found. That is not to say that we need to question all missing persons cases. It is just to say we need to start looking at what do we think may have occurred or may have led up to this disappearance, right? It is not meant to question that person's disappearance in the sense of like victim blaming or anything. But the key thing here is that if we don't think this was voluntary at all costs, what are some examples as to why we think this person may be missing and may just, have left their phone off, right? So like, do they usually always check in whenever they travel? Are they always the ones who like pick their kids up after school or drop them off and maybe they didn't check in or maybe they didn't contact anyone and they didn't show up? to pick up their kids, or they didn't show up to work. And normally they are so prompt, or they always let us know, right? What are some things that are out of the ordinary that are causing us some of this alarm, and really trying to question some of that. Do we think this could also be connected to force or to violence, right? Do we know if there's a history of violence or abuse in the relationship that person is with? Is there a log of any kind of abusive behaviors? For instance, have they previously had like a protection order or something that we would have a log or some kind of a paper trail to suggest that they may be they may have disappeared as a response to violence. Who is the missing person in contact with, right? So can we get in contact with other folks to make sure that they haven't heard from them? Or have we contacted their work? Have we contacted their kids' school? Have we contacted their relatives, whether that's in the area or outside of the area? You know, who can we start trying to get in touch with so that we can see if they've heard from them? So common misconceptions that typically come out of a missing persons report or a missing persons case. So one, you do not have to wait to file a missing persons report. I know that TV and really, unfortunately, oftentimes a lot of our community programs and services have this misconception that you have to wait 24, 48, 72, or some other type of time frame before you can file a missing persons report. That is absolutely not true. You can file a missing persons report as soon as you know someone is missing. And I absolutely encourage you to do that, is to report that to police as soon as you think someone is missing, right? And reiterate this to police if they start to push back on this. And the reason for this is because, okay, what is the best worst case scenario here, right? You filed a missing persons report and they weren't actually missing and we found them and they're safe, right? I would much rather we do that than just say, well, let's just wait and see, right? I want there to be some movement happening here to make sure that we are logging this and making sure our loved ones are actually safe. It is also really important to recognize, and I'll share more on NAMIS here in just a minute, but that National Persons Missing Database, anyone can log a case into NAMIS. So this was actually something I learned in working with the folks on LB 154. Anyone can log in a case. And so what it does is when someone logs in a case, that then pings law enforcement, and they will have to investigate that case, or at least provide an update to determine if either it's a duplicate entry or to actually start follow-up if it's a new case that's found. So if you're worried of, oh, well, they may already have a case in the system, that's okay. Still log it if you're not sure, because I'd rather we have multiple ways of tracking that someone is missing than to have nothing at all. And then also recognizing you do not have to wait for police to start looking for a person or to organize search parties, right? So especially if you feel like your report was not taken seriously, or if somebody is trying to say, well, we just don't have the resources to go look for them right now, you as a family member, as a community member, can start those search parties on your own and can organize your communities to start those search parties. You do not have to wait for law enforcement. So then after we've kind of evaluated some of these initial first steps, we then have to ask ourselves, okay, what do we do now if we're pretty sure someone is missing, right? So the first thing that we really want to start doing is starting a timeline. So immediately write down everything that you can think of for the last 72 hours. And you're going to keep this log or this journal or however you're writing this down with you, even if it's notes on your phone, right? Keep this with you and immediately start recording everything that you can remember within the last 72 hours, the who, what, when, where, why, how, because this will help, because as time goes on and as you're taking in more information, you're going to start forgetting some of these details, right? So if you write them down, you will at least have some of that memory preserved, and you'll have that to reference back to. We also really want to focus on preserving as much as possible and quickly. And so what I mean by this is touch as little as possible of the person's things, just in case investigators need that, or in case we think there was some violence that may have occurred. It may be a crime scene. Ask law enforcement to file a letter of preservation to a cell phone company. Cell phone companies oftentimes will begin purging their data after 72 hours. And there are several sample letter templates online that you can find to file something like this. It also will require separate letters or a request of preservation to be filed with social media apps. So things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, In the meantime, as a backup until you get this, I always recommend take screenshots, record your screen, save absolutely anything you can, start going through their social media and see if they mentioned anything and just start trying to save some of that. So when it comes to social media, I've included some links here. Fortunately or unfortunately, anytime that we are requesting for a social media outlet to actually save or archive or preserve this data for someone, it usually, like I said, does require a law enforcement official that has to actually enter that information or put in that request. So again, the more that you all have this language at your disposal and some of the lingo that they use. So when you say, I need a letter of preservation, or we need to file to preserve their social media, and have the links ready for them. Again, the quicker that we can at least get this logged, and maybe then folks will take your case seriously. When it comes to alert systems, so a lot of times I've had a couple of questions from folks where they're like, well, why didn't they issue a missing persons like alert system, you know, where our phones all start blaring because we have like a child in danger or something of that nature. And so there are some criteria that do have to be met before something like that can be issued. In Nebraska, there is the Endangered Missing Advisory. So this is for whenever the criteria is not met for an Amber Alert. So this criteria can fall under a person who's missing for unexplained, involuntary, or suspicious circumstances, believed to be in danger because of their age, health, cognitive or physical disability, weather conditions, they've been in the company of a dangerous person, or other factors. There's enough kind of descriptive information that if we send out a public alert, that the public actually could assist in something like this. And it usually has to be within 72 hours of when the person first went missing. So keeping that in mind when it comes to issuing an alert like this. And again, law enforcement have to be the ones to issue that alert. An Amber Alert is when we are dealing with a child abduction or a child that is in imminent danger, and that is someone under the age of 17. Other alerts that you may have heard about, Nebraska Silver Alerts, the criteria actually varies by state, but this is typically for missing adults over the age of 65 who have been medically diagnosed with something like Alzheimer's or dementia or some kind of mental disability. And then there are also Ashanti alerts, which are missing persons over the age of 17 who, again, don't fit the criteria for Amber or Silver alerts. So again, kind of continuing off of, okay, well, how do we keep, working to kind of preserve some of this information when someone is missing? So I am very big on have a detailed description of the missing person. So especially if you knew what they were wearing, sometimes you may not. But having some kind of description of that, we really want to try to get everything that we can on them. So their hair length and color, their weight, height, age, if they have any tattoos or other distinguishing features like a birthmark or a scar or something. I really would like you all to track tribal affiliations in a case like this, because again, that just leads to more connection. So maybe the person is enrolled in one tribe, but they also have tribal affiliations with other tribes. We really want to have that recorded so that then we can start contacting those relative communities and trying to have folks on the lookout. Additional helpful information, if you have any kind of info on what their regular schedule looks like. So let's say they always leave their house between like 8 o'clock and 8:15. They usually take this route to work. This is where they work between these hours. They go pick up their kids at this time, typically. So any kind of, regular routine sort of thing that we have, like every Tuesday night, they go to bead class, or every Friday, they go work out at the gym. We really just want to try and have any of that information, those locations. And also if you have their vehicle information, especially if that vehicle is missing. And then also identify one person to be the primary point of contact for everything. And the reason that you want to select one person is so that every time we have somebody from law enforcement or, if we're calling, relative communities, we always say, call this person at this phone number, is so that one person has all the information. And so we're not having to try and then gather, if we have, one contact for each different entity, then we're not having to say, I don't know, you got to call this person to find out what the police said, and you got to call this person to find out what this tribal nation said. We really just want all of it to go to one person. So then I'm also very big on encouraging folks to journal absolutely everything, because again, especially for relatives who are having to deal with a family member or a loved one who's missing, that's a lot of trauma to have on your brain. And so you really want to make sure that you're recording as much as possible, because your brain really works to try and protect you from trauma. And so you may not be able to take in all of the information. And also, again, just so that in the long term, you have a record of everything. So anytime you speak with someone, you want to get their name, when you filed something. So if you filed a police report, you want that date. If you want that police report number, any questions that you asked and any answers you got. Really want to try to write down everything you remember at the end of each day, sort of just in case. So it would be best to go kind of as you go, and then just sort of do a summary at the end of the day. Monitor, take screenshots of any relevant social media, especially if any Snapchats are still live on like their main story. You really want to try and get some of that. Digitally record all conversations, phone calls. So just pulling out the recorder on your device, excuse me. Nebraska is a one-party consent state, meaning that only one person in a conversation needs consent to record it. So that can also be really helpful as you're taking in a lot of information if you can't write down that quickly. I'm also really big on, especially if you're working with law enforcement, you may have to contact multiple law enforcement agencies. So it may be tribal police, it may be the BIA or FBI, county police, city police, state patrol. It depends on where you are in your jurisdiction and sort of what the circumstances were. Keep a log of when you call, who you talk to, ask for officers' names and their badge numbers. And I will say that sometimes if you're getting a little bit of resistance from law enforcement, if you ask for a name and a badge number, sometimes they get a little more helpful. And then also, any kind of report or investigation numbers, all of that is going to be helpful when you're calling back and you're trying to get folks to pull up the new information. So then there are some possible legal avenues for folks that I also want to share, keeping in mind I'm not an attorney, but I will share about a legal resource here for you at the end. So if a person is missing, so we do not know if they are deceased or not, but we're pretty sure they're not. A loved one can actually file for an emergency guardianship over a missing adult. So basically the argument here is that, well, they don't really have the capacity to make decisions for themselves, right? Because they're missing. This is not a guarantee that it's going to get granted, but it's just a possibility. If the victim is deceased, a loved one could possibly file to be the personal representative of that deceased person's estate. And then basically what this does is this enables a guardian to then have access or to help keep track of things like phone records, bank records, child support, Social Security, tribal or BIA accounts. It gives you a digital footprint on like their text messages, their phone, any kind of videos downloaded, anything like that. So again, this is just a potential legal avenue that family members may have as they're navigating a case like this. So then that leads into, okay, well, what do we not want to do in an MMIP situation, right? So when we have a case like this, there are a few things that we want to avoid. And the first one is not to confront a suspected perpetrator or perpetrators that we think may be involved in the missing person's case, especially if we think violence has occurred. And I know that can be really, really difficult for those of us who are really passionate and we want to, go up to the person and say, I know what you did, and you're not going to get away with it, or just tell me where they are. And the reason that we dissuade against this is because you're not only putting yourself at risk, but you're also putting the victim at risk, right? So it's the same thing that we usually tell folks with a human trafficking situation. Confronting a suspected trafficker or a perpetrator is a really dangerous situation, and is just not something that we can promote. We also want to be really aware of fraud attempts. Unfortunately, there are some not great people out there who will try to take advantage of a missing person situation and will try to exploit that person's loved ones they'll claim that they may be providing some kind of services or information for a fee. Most legitimate services that are actually going to help you are not going to charge a fee. At most, they might request some kind of reimbursement or lodging or transportation, but again, that is very unlikely. And you can always verify these kind of agency services or something of that nature through either law enforcement or calling your Secretary of State, trying to get some kind of asking for some kind of references, things like that, all to kind of verify this. And then for supporters in a community, so if you're especially like if you're in a tribal community or trying to assist a family, my big thing with this is not blaming the victim. I don't care what the circumstances are. I don't care what the situation was. It is not that victim's fault. And if you can't show up for their loved ones, if you can't be there to only support them and to say, how can I help, without your bias, without your own agenda or conditions, then really we would probably recommend that you stay home, right? Because you're going to be doing more harm than you are good. I'm very big on lateral violence. Victim blaming has no place here. So we have to kind of move beyond that. So again, additional kind of initial action that folks can take, issuing alerts and spreading information. So call your relatives, call your community members, call anybody that you think may have a connection to this person, make posts on social media. I'm sure most of you who identify as Native and are on social media know that we typically get at least 2 to 3 missing persons posts a week. Whereas like national media or even local media may not be picking up on any of that. Hand out posters, circulate flyers, follow that person's normal routine because maybe you'll come across something, right? Take photos of locations as well as you go there because again, maybe you will see something later. For community action, I am very big on it is never too early to host a walk or a vigil or something to raise awareness or to promote, hey, we are looking for this person or we can't find them or something really bad has happened. And then also really emphasizing taking care of yourself, whether you are a community member, whether you are a family or a loved one, ask for help. You don't have to do this alone. And also very much, I would highly recommend considering counseling services. There's a lot of great mental health resources here in Nebraska, especially for Native communities and tribal folks. Pray, take part in ceremony, focus on your self-care as best you can. So we're talking basic self-care. Have you ate? Have you slept? Have you had a shower? Have you breathed, taken a couple of deep breaths at a time? This is a really scary and traumatic situation that can occur to anyone, even if we have a great outcome and someone's home safe and sound. This can take a real big stressful toll on your body. And I need you to try and take care of yourself and for your loved one that you're looking for. So additional resources for families that also, so I already mentioned NAMUS, that not just law enforcement have access to this database, you have access to it. The Sovereign Bodies Institute, I mentioned, has one of the largest databases, and they also have a lot of resources and support networks for missing and murdered Indigenous peoples' families. You can check out their website typically for resources, and then their Facebook typically has more like their support groups and things of that nature. They are a very small nonprofit, and so sometimes they come up on capacity, and so they may have to shut down calls every now and then. So it's just more to, it's an additional resource for you to look into. National Indigenous Women's Resource Center also has a lot of trainings, webinars. They actually have resources and toolkits for folks if you're navigating a situation like this. And then you can also look into the Nebraska Crime Commission. They have a crime victims reparations fund, meaning that if there are any kind of expenses in relation to someone's victimization, so for instance, they assist with things like hospital bills, funeral costs, things of that nature, and in relation to violent crime, you can also apply for that and look into that to get reimbursed. So then additional kind of support for families who are going through something like this. One, for those of you who hopefully are not directly experiencing this situation, it's good for you all to know this so that as that family is kind of in this traumatic situation, you can be sort of a clear head to say, okay, here's what I remember and here's what we can do. Your job really is going to be on organizing food, funding, any kind of necessities, all of those super organized, like great community organizers. You all are like our top people to help with things like that, helping to organize kind of volunteers, scheduling shifts, focusing on the victim and their loved ones. So not turning the narrative on yourself is always a big thing here. It's not all about how all this great work that you did. It's about focusing on this family and the care and support they need as they try to find their loved one. And then how to be a good ally in this area. So I'm very big on, educating yourself. Obviously, this is a great first step. There's a lot of other great awareness events that are happening all this week, and videos and resources you can reach out to. So especially for our non-Native allies, using your privilege to speak out, even if it seems scary or inconvenient, just imagine how it is for us as Native people to try and speak out on this. It's even scarier. Be prepared to do the work and not relying on us to do all the work for you. So educating yourself with some of the resources that we share, looking into those resources, listening to our stories, and not just saying, can you tell me everything about MMIP, right? Not denying this history or the lived experiences that we have. That's not going to get us anywhere in terms of actually trying to address this. And then also recognizing that you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then it's not to say that you're going to be 100% completely perfect, but when you try to do no harm, if you do harm, apologize when someone expresses that you have, even if it was unintentional. So I have never known of anyone with a situation where when someone has said that offended me and somebody then tried to say, well, you shouldn't be offended by that. I don't know of a time when the person was like, oh, you're right, I shouldn't be offended, right? So instead, it's just apologize and do better. Don't try to justify your actions. And so all of that can be helpful in moving towards allyship here. Unhelpful practices to avoid. So focusing the narrative on yourself instead of those in need. So I'm very big, especially when folks hear about this, we usually have a lot of really kind-hearted folks who are just like, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. And I want to help and I want to do things. I usually have to kind of ask folks to take a step and take a beat for a second and to ask yourself, would you help us? Would you come into our communities? Would you actually really, truly show up to help us? If there was no camera or documentation that you were ever there, why do you actually want to be involved, right? Do you want to be involved because this tugged at your heartstrings, or do you want to be involved because you really believe that we deserve safety and that you support our tribal sovereignty and that you support our tribal communities? And also asking yourself, who's already doing the work and how can you assist and support them, right? So I say this, and I don't say this to be rude, we don't need saviors, right? We don't need folks coming in and saying, I heard about this terrible, horrible thing that's happening. Here's my solution on how you're going to fix it, right? We, in our tribal communities, are the experts. We know what the solutions are, right? Like we know a lot of the times what we need. We need you to listen to us and what we're asking for, and we need you to support that and to show up without trying to sort of school us or tell us how we should be doing it differently, right? And really centering and uplifting the voices of Native survivors and the family members who have a loved one who is missing or who has been murdered, right? And our tribal communities, not centering your voice in how you perceive all of this. And then really along with this, and I can't believe I have to say this, not profiting off of our stories, right? So do not sell MMIP merchandise. Do not apply for grants to try and study our communities unless the majority of those proceeds are going to support families, are going to support research and violence prevention in our communities. Again, we don't need folks telling us how to fix this, right? We know how to fix this. We need you to listen to us and what we're asking for. But then above all else with all of these situations, as I kind of wrap up here, and then we can see if there are any questions, really having this sense of leading with compassion, right? So recognizing that no matter the circumstances, no matter what happened, no matter what our flaws seem to be, or what the, bad, terrible things that should have been a warning sign for this case to have been avoided at all costs, we really have to recognize that at the end of the day, we have an individual, we have a human being in front of us who is missing, who may have been murdered, and we have folks who are asking for help, right? So it doesn't matter if the person was drunk. It doesn't matter if the person had a substance abuse issue. It doesn't matter if they went walking home alone late at night. It doesn't matter if they went to a really ruckus party and everybody should have known they shouldn't have gone to that house or something. It doesn't matter. It matters that that person who is innocent in this was missing, right? Or was murdered. And that is not their fault. And we have to really kind of recognize the humanity in that. And so having compassion for that person, recognizing that this family needs all of our support and needs all of our compassion is really how we have to approach this work, whether we're Native or non-Native. So with all of that, I do want to just kind of highlight a few resources. So national resources that are available. The Strong Hearts Native Helpline is a 24/7 anonymous hotline that is available for folks who are navigating a situation. It's available to Native survivors of violence to get culturally relevant services. It's also available for loved ones who don't know how to help their it's available to family members who don't know how to help their loved one, who may also be looking for resources to help their loved one. It's available to service providers who may not know about tribal resources or who may want assistance, kind of learning more information. There's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Statewide resources, I want to highlight Legal Aid of Nebraska's Native American program. This is a nonprofit law firm that specifically provides legal services to Native individuals here in Nebraska. And will absolutely help Native survivors if they need things like a protection order or divorce or custody from an abusive situation, with a housing case. They will also help loved ones as if they are looking for any kind of legal avenues to navigate a situation like this. Again, sometimes that's successful, sometimes it's not, but you can at least always call and reach out and see what some options are. And then also just want to highlight the Nebraska Tribal Domestic Violence programs that again are also available to folks that may be looking for assistance. So with that, I want to say, Wado, thank you for letting me talk your ear off for the last couple of minutes. Questions, comments, concerns? Misty, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kirby. Thank you for all of that really good information. I do. I have a couple of things that I wanted to share. I am going to share screen right quick. We've got a couple things that are coming up that I wanted to share. The Bluebird Cultural Initiative, they are doing awesome work down in Omaha, and they are doing a MMIWR awareness big drum round dance. And that is Nicole and the Bluebird Cultural Initiative. That is taking place May 4th from 5 to 7:30 at Turner Park. And I also wanted to share the Winnebago round dance. Tiki Whitewater over there in Winnebago and others have put together a round dance. It was originally supposed to be last week, but it had to be rescheduled. So that is going to be May 8th in Winnebago, and there is a list of drums there. Part of it's like cut off. I believe it starts at 6. Do you remember, Kirby?
Yes, so the meal is going to start at 6 and then dancing starts at 7.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So those are a couple of events that are coming up, and to help support the cause and raise awareness, and maybe help bring healing to the families. And so those were a couple of things that I wanted to share. The other thing I was wanting you to talk about was, can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with the NCFF trafficking project?
Absolutely. And one more event I want to share is that on May 5th here in Omaha, there is going to be an MMIP walk that Project Beacon with NICWC is also putting on. That's May 5th from noon to 3. And that will be on Dodge Street. So, but yeah, so the work that Misty and I have been working on for a couple of months now has been a grant that actually specifically focuses on the trafficking outcomes for trafficked Indigenous youth. So we held some listening sessions in all 4 tribal communities with some key partners. We also had a listening session with federal partners as well, just to see what response looked like when it came to human trafficking excuse me, in our tribal communities. And so we are actually finishing up a checklist that is going to be coming out and will be distributed to service providers, navigating how to handle a human trafficking situation, as well as available tribal resources for folks. We want to spread this again far and wide. So we will be posting it to NICWC's website. We're also planning to post it to NITAV's website once it's up and running. Because again, we don't feel like this needs to be something that's shared like only between, you have to be in the industry, so to speak. We want anyone who needs this information to have it. So again, this will focus mostly on human trafficking, and we know human trafficking absolutely feeds into the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, especially when it comes to not being able to know where a loved one is at a certain time. Excuse me. And so that's kind of the main thing that we have been kind of coming out with here pretty soon. Like I said, we'll share it far and wide once it's finalized. The other kind of thing that we have is that we drafted a report following the listening sessions with some recommendations, and we will be sharing that out as well once it gets final approval from the federal agency that the grant is through. And just really trying to get, especially mostly like non-tribal organizations, to understand like, this is what it looks like, this is a serious matter, and this is what our tribal communities have said they need. Because I feel like a lot of times, like, we hear about human trafficking and we either don't totally have a great idea of what it looks like, or folks kind of have this conception of like, well, here's how we think should be a one-size-fits-all way of fixing it. And it's very different between tribal communities, and we need to listen to tribal communities specifically with what they're asking for. Misty, do you think I hit most of the highlights for that?
Yeah, and I apologize, I was looking for something. So did you talk about the list of resources and yeah, I think you did.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. After I said that, and I was like, oh no, I think I heard her say something about.
No, you're good.
And did you talk about training for tribes?
Yes. Or sorry, no, I didn't, but yes, I will mention that as well. Yes. So we will also be conducting some trainings on how to use this tool that we're coming out with. And then really any kind of support that folks need, please reach out to me or Misty. If we can't do it, we'll find you somebody who can help with training or education or anything of that nature, either about human trafficking, intimate partner violence, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. We will talk about all of it because folks need to know.
Thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions or would like to know more about NICWC, please visit our website at www.nicwic.org.